Okay, so you're obviously in a biology class. You signed up for biology. What is biology? Well, whenever you see an ology at the end, that's the study of. And does anyone know what bio means? What's the prefix bio? Not matter, no. Bio is actually a Greek prefix meaning life. Okay, so biology is the study of life. There's many different forms of biology. You could be a geneticist, you could be an ecologist, you could be a medical doctor, right? I mean, the branches of biology. There's ornithology, that's the study of birds. There's ichthyology, that's the study of fish, right? All of those things are branches of biology. So, but what biology is at its root is the study of living things. But what is a living thing? Okay. You guys did a little bit of work in Science 10, but I know Science 10 last year was a bit of a different beast, right? Some of your teachers might not have had time to cover biology, or you might have covered it very quickly. So let's just have a little refresher on what a living thing is. So first of all, what is the picture that I've chosen on that slide there? What is that an illustration of? They're cells. Okay. Now, are they plant cells? Are they animal cells? Well, if I had to make an educated guess, I would say they're animal cells, right? They don't have a cell wall. They're not green. They don't have chlorophyll. They don't have a big central vacuole, right? So they're probably animal cells. But the number one thing about living things, okay, and that all living things have in common is that all living things are made up of cells. I really should have that S in brackets though, because there are many living things that aren't made up of numerous cells, but are actually made up of just one cell, right? So first and foremost, living things are made up of a cell or cells. All cells also come from pre-existing cells. Now, again, in Science 10, if you would have studied biology, the biology unit, you would have talked about the cell theory, and you would have talked about spontaneous generation and about those scientists, Spallanzini, and you would have talked about Pasteur and all that kind of stuff, and spontaneous generation. And spontaneous generation was this idea that living things just poof came out of nothing, right? If you left a bunch of dirty clothes in the corner, eventually mice would grow out of them. If you left some soup on a counter, eventually mold would grow, right? It was just came out of nothing. But what we now know is that all cells have to come from an original cell. That's the cell theory. Another thing about living things is that they all respond to their environments. Now, again, you might be thinking, well, no, how does that plant over there in my windowsill? I can go over there and kick the plant, right? I can throw it on the ground and it's not going to do anything to me. It's not going to respond to me. But response can come in many different forms, right? And again, in Science 10, you guys learned about something called phototrophism. I don't know if you remember that one, but plants will actually grow toward light, right? There's also something called gravitropism, right? Where roots will grow toward gravity, right? Toward the earth, and stems will grow away, right? There's negative and positive gravitrophism. So yes, plants will respond to their environments, just in maybe a different way than you think of responding, right? You, on the other hand, you have much more complex responses. Regardless, though, all living things will respond to their environments and they will strive to maintain an internal environment. And this is known as homeostasis. This is probably, next to biology, this is the most biology word out there. Okay, and another word for homeostasis is balance. So all living things will try to maintain a specific balance. So for example, you guys, if it gets too warm in here, you'll start to get flushed, your skin will start to turn red, and you'll start to sweat eventually, right? You might start to fan yourself to cool yourself off. Those are all responses to an external stimuli. What happens if it gets too cold? Well, you might kind of curl up, right? You might kind of put your hands in your armpits. You might shrug your shoulders a little bit to try and shrink yourself, right? Eventually, if you get really cold, what happens? You might start to shiver, right? Okay. So those are all ways that you try and maintain an internal temperature of about 37 degrees, right? If you drink too much water, you go pee, right? If you don't drink enough water, you don't urinate as much. Again, that's a response to your environment. So homeostasis is balance, and homeostasis counteracts something known as entropy or disorder. So life is kind of like a teenager's bedroom, right? Um, you might your parents might make you clean it, or your mom, if you're really lucky, might come in there and clean it for you. But eventually, if you're just being yourself, I have a teenager at home, a bedroom gets to be a disaster, right? There actually has to be effort put in to maintain that clean bedroom. And that kind of goes for homeostasis. We actually have to put in effort to maintain homeostasis, and that comes in the form of energy. Okay, so disorder, that's entropy, and fighting against disorder, that's homeostasis. Now, the third thing all living things have in common is something known as metabolism. So, all living things will acquire and use energy. Again, how do the plants in my windowsill acquire and use energy? Well, they're autotrophs, so they get their energy from the sun. Okay, how do you acquire and use energy? Well, in about 45 minutes from now, you're going to have lunch. You're going to eat something, right? So you're what's known as a heterotroph. You have to get your energy from outside sources. So regardless whether you're a plant or a human or a bird or a fish or a bacteria, whatever, you have to obtain energy from your environment. Now, the collection of chemical reactions that help you to obtain that energy is collectively called metabolism. Okay, now in a human cell, there are over 100,000 different reactions. And all of those reactions are built around using energy somehow, obtaining energy, building new cells. And those more than 100,000 different reactions can be broken down into two types of reactions. Okay, catabolic and anabolic. Now, you're going to notice that biology is language heavy. Every day I'm going to be giving you new words, new words, new words every single day. Okay, and that's kind of where a vocabulary list comes in handy, and highlighting your note package comes in handy. But there's also little tricks. Okay, now catabolic and anabolic sound very similar. So I'll give you an example of a silly little trick that I use. So basically, metabolism can be broken down into two types of reactions, catabolic and anabolic. Now, in catabolic reactions, this is where we take large molecules and break them down into smaller molecules. Okay, so in catabolic, we take a large molecule and we break it down into a smaller molecule. Now, the way I remember this is the prefix cat. When I was in college, my first little apartment, somebody gave me a cat. And I love animals, right? That's part of why I'm in biology. I love animals, but I love wildlife. And I'm more of a dog person than a cat person. I wasn't a huge fan of cats, but whatever. I wasn't going to be mean to this thing. And I took it in and I feeded it and I showed it affection. But this cat, I think, came straight from hell. It was the spawn of Satan. This thing ripped my couches apart. It ate my favorite hat, believe it or not. It ate the remote control for my TV. This thing was, like I said, it was the spawn of Satan. So whenever I think of cats, I never owned a cat after that one. Whenever I think of cats, I think of that cat destroying my little apartment. So I think of my couch being torn apart. I think of my remote control being broken apart. So when I think about catabolic, I think of destruction. I think of things getting broken, right? That's kind of what a catabolic reaction is. It's when we take larger things and we break them apart, right? So you might think, oh, that's a silly little anecdote, but it always helps me to remember the difference between catabolic and anabolic. I just think cat, oh yeah, that stupid cat I had 30 years ago breaking my stuff, right? And I think, oh yeah, catabolic, breaking apart molecules. Okay, anabolic is the reaction. Is the opposite reaction. So in anabolic, what we're doing is we're taking many smaller molecules and we are making larger molecules out of them. Okay. I don't have a silly anecdote for that one, but I just remember catabolic and I know anabolic's the opposite. All right, so together, catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions form metabolism. Now, many of the reactions we're going to be talking about in the next couple of chapters, in this one, as well as in photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and digestion, we're going to be talking about catabolic and anabolic reactions. I'll give you specific examples of these. Now, all living things have a few things in common. We've talked about them. They're made of cells. They strive for homeostasis. They obtain energy. But all living cells are made of non-living materials. And when we're talking about biochemistry, when we're talking about the building blocks of life, these molecules can be kind of classified under 5 categories. Okay, so we're going to spend some time today talking about carbohydrates, spend some time on Thursday talking about lipids. On Friday, we're actually going to go to the lab, but we're also going to talk a little bit about proteins before we go to the lab. And then we're going to talk about nucleic acids and vitamins and minerals. All right, now you guys have probably heard of some of these things before. You've probably heard of carbohydrates. Does anyone know what another name for lipids is? What's a more common name for a lipid? Does anyone know? Fats, right? So you guys have heard of fats before. You've heard of protein, right? Especially if you're an athlete, right? You might have paid particular attention to protein. I see guys walking down the hallway and girls walking down the hallway with their blender bottles full of protein shakes, right? We'll talk about that stuff later on. And then nucleic acids and vitamins and minerals we'll mention as well. Okay. Now there's a lot of myths surrounding many of these. Some people think that fats are awful and we should avoid them, right? Some people think, oh, proteins are great. We got to take as much protein as we can. So I'm going to dispel some myths surrounding this stuff. We'll talk a little bit about nutrition, but we will talk about the chemical properties of these things as well. So before we start talking about specific macronutrients, we should define what a nutrient is and what a macronutrient is. Okay, so a nutrient is any substance that has a useful function in our body. Okay, so any substance that has a useful function. Now, depending on how much of these substances you need to take in a day, we can take nutrients and classify them into 2 categories. Macro. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I teach this class a lot of times by breaking words down. It's easier to understand them. Macro means large. So macronutrients are nutrients that are required in large amounts on a daily basis. And we measure the amount that we need to take in grams. So for example, if you are an athlete and you're very, very active and you're trying to put on muscle mass, they say that you need about 1 gram of protein per pound of lean body tissue. So if you're a 200-pound elite hockey player, you should be eating about 200 grams of protein in a day. Okay, and that's a lot. Fats fall into this category, proteins as well as carbohydrates. So carbs, fats, and proteins all fall under the category of macronutrients. Does anyone know what the prefix for little is? If macro is large, what's little? Does anyone know? Micro, right. There you go. You guys are getting the hang of it already. So micronutrients are nutrients that we need in small amounts each day. This is usually measured in milligrams or even micrograms. But just because we don't need very much of it doesn't mean that it's not really important. Okay, there are some horrible diseases and disorders that you can get for not having enough vitamin C or enough vitamin D or enough iron or calcium or potassium. So there's lots of, just because we need very small amounts doesn't mean that that they're not extremely important. Okay, so things like vitamins and minerals fall under micronutrients. So vitamin D, for example, I want to show you. I'm not a fan of vitamins, and I'll tell you why. Like vitamin supplements, I don't think that you need to take those giant horse pills every day that some people take. I have a few friends who are doctors. I've actually done some research. I've asked my own doctor about this. I've read some studies, and many studies say that multivitamins are useless if your diet is good. Okay, or unless you're a pregnant woman, or you're trying to get pregnant, or you have some sort of anemia or some sort of disorder, you don't need a multivitamin. Now, recently I've been doing some reading about this guy, vitamin D3. We get vitamin D from our food, but we also get it from sunlight. Okay, and vitamin D in the wintertime, many Canadians don't get enough vitamin D. We should get about 1,000 units of vitamin D in our diet every day. I want to show you what 1,000 units of vitamin D looks like. Can you guys see that? That's 1,000 units of vitamin D. That's your entire daily intake of vitamin D if you were to get none in your food. All right. So that's what I mean by a micronutrient. That's not very much, right? And that's more than enough you need every day right there. I just recently started taking a D vitamin because I'm getting older. I'm almost 50. Vitamin D. But if you have a good diet, you drink milk, you eat meat, you should be okay as far as your vitamin D goes. But you know, don't take a daily vitamin. They're really expensive, and a lot of times they just end up in your urine, and you're getting rid of a lot of money down the drain. Okay. Now, what happens if you don't get enough of these? Well, goiter. You can see that big enlargement of the thyroid gland, which is found kind of near your voice box. That's caused by an iodine deficiency. Rickets, that vitamin D I just showed you. If you are severely malnourished and you're basically starving to death, you're not getting enough vitamin D when you're a kid, your bones won't develop properly, and you can get that rickets. Scurvy, you guys, have you ever heard of scurvy? Who used to get scurvy? Yeah, pirates. You hear that, you scurvy, right? What is scurvy? It's a vitamin C deficiency. Where do we get vitamin C from? Oranges, strawberries, limes, that sort of thing. Basically, like 3 strawberries, that's your entire vitamin C for your entire day. One small orange, more that's like 110% of your vitamin C in a day. So we usually get more than enough vitamin C. But if you don't get any vitamin C for long periods of time, your teeth will fall out. You can get scurvy. Okay. Now, vitamin A, that's kind of cut off by the screen there. Vitamin A, that's supplemented in our diet here in Canada. But if you don't get vitamin A, it can cause blindness. Okay, so even though we need very, very small amounts of this stuff, if we don't get it, we can get some very serious diseases. So what I want to talk about today, I want to get started on talking about carbohydrates. Okay, so carbohydrates are a macronutrient. And believe it or not, carbohydrates should make up the bulk of your diet. In fact, carbohydrates should make up about 60 to 70% of your actual daily intake of food. Unfortunately, today in the media and in magazines and on the internet, carbohydrates have been given a really bad name. And there's these low carb diets like Atkins and South Beach and all these things where you're not supposed to have like keto is another one right now that's a big craze, right? Where you're not supposed to have carbohydrates. And I'm here to tell you that that's wrong. Carbohydrates should actually make up the bulk of your diet. Now, why are carbohydrates so important? Because their main role, their primary role in your life is for energy. They are the gas that runs your cells. Just like I need to stop at the gas station every once in a while and fill up my gas tank so that my car runs, this is what you run on, carbs. Okay, they provide a fast source of energy for your cells. They're used in the powerhouse of your cells in your mitochondria, and they're used in cellular respiration to create something called ATP. Okay, so on an exam, I might ask you, a good question might be, what is the primary source for energy in your cells? A, fats, B, proteins, C, carbohydrates, and D, vitamins. Okay, now can fats be used for energy in your body? Yes. Can proteins be used for energy in your body? Yes. But the primary source for energy in your body, in your cells, is carbohydrates. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, carbohydrates should make up the majority of your diet. Roughly, in a healthy person's diet, about 60% should be from carbohydrates. Now, not all carbohydrates are made equally. Some are better for you than others. We'll talk about that. Your body cannot make its own carbohydrates. So, where do we get our carbs from? We get them either directly or indirectly from plants. Because carbohydrates originally come from photosynthesis. We're going to talk all about that in our next chapter in about a week from now. But photosynthesis is where plants use sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, and create sugar. Another name for a carbohydrate is a sugar. Okay, and again, we always think, oh, sugar's bad, sugar's bad. Well, there are certain sugars we shouldn't have as much of, and there are other sugars that are better for us. Okay, so where can carbohydrates be found? Well, when we think of carbohydrate-rich foods, we think of potatoes, rice, bread, okay, corn, fruit. Now I could add things like chocolate bars and Slurpees and Pepsi and that sort of thing in there, but eventually, where do those things get their carbohydrates from? Well, things like high fructose corn syrup, so they get it from corn, right? They get it from they get it from things like sugar beets and sugar cane and that sort of thing. So plants, okay? Plants are the original source of carbohydrates. So all carbohydrates, again, originally come from plants. And all carbohydrates have a couple of things in common. Number one, they all have carbon in them, they all have hydrogen, and they all have oxygen. So an example of a carbohydrate, a chemical formula would be C6H12O6. Okay, this is the carbohydrate. Does anyone, by chance, anyone want to take a guess of what that carb is? It's the simplest sugar of all sugars. Right on, yeah. This is glucose. Okay, actually, it's also fructose, but we'll talk more about why that is later. Okay, so you'll notice that there is carbon in there, there's hydrogen, and there's oxygen. Okay, now all carbohydrates have those three elements in their chemical formulas. Now, before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of it all, I want you guys to understand a few chemical terms so that we understand biochemistry a little bit more. We are going to be talking a lot about polymers. Now, again, what is a polymer? Guys, I like to break down words, right? It helps me to remember stuff, and sometimes it'll help you guys as well. And many of these terms you already know. What is poly? Poly, anyone want to take a guess? I think I heard mumbles out there. Poly means many. Okay, so a polymer is a molecule that's composed of many smaller repeating subunits. Now, a subunit is also called a mer. So a polymer is many of these subunits put together in a chain. So when I think of a polymer, I think of a paperclip chain. If I take one paperclip is a monomer. Mono means what? One. One mer, a monomer, would be one paperclip. If I put 10 paper clips together in a big long chain, I now have a polymer of paper clips. Okay? So a polymer is a monomer joined together many, many times in a big, long, repeating chain. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, all the macromolecules we're going to be talking about come in polymer form. So before I told you that not all carbohydrates were built equally. And right now with this keto craze, and you know what, guys? Before keto, it was something called South Beach. And before South Beach, it was something called Atkins. There's always these new diets that are coming out that say eliminate carbs. Okay. First of all, whenever you hear the word diet, ignore whatever comes after that. We should not be on diets. But there are better ways to eat than others. So carbohydrates are not bad. In fact, they should make up the majority of your diet, but they come in two forms, simple and complex. And depending on the form, your body uses them differently. Okay. So when I say that carbohydrates should make up the bulk of your diet, I'm not talking about simple carbohydrates. These should be limited in your diet. The majority of your carbohydrates should come in the form of complex carbs. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Simple carbohydrates are just that. They're simple, meaning that your body can absorb them, break them down, and store them very easily. Okay, they're small. They usually consist of one monomer. Okay, so simple carbohydrates usually consist of only one or two sugar units. Now, you guys said before, you know what the prefix mono means. Mono means one, okay? And saccharide means sweet, okay? So we use the suffix saccharide when we're talking about sugars. So a monosaccharide is any sugar that is made up of one unit. Now, if I were you guys, I would know some examples of a monosaccharide. So already you guys knew the simplest of all sugars, glucose, C6H12O6. Okay, you've all heard of that. Fructose, if you look on many candy bars or sweetened drinks like sweetened apple juice or orange juice, or you look at Coke or a Pepsi or a Sprite or whatever, you will see glucose and fructose in there. These are incredibly simple sugars. They're made up of one sugar unit. They're easily absorbed by your digestive system. They get into your bloodstream really quickly, and your body needs to deal with them. Okay, the lesser known one is galactose. A lot of people don't know what galactose is, but it is a simple sugar as well. Now, what do all three of these words have in common? They end in OSE. So generally, if you see a word ending in OSE, it's a sugar, it's a carbohydrate. So your diet should consist of around 60 to 70% carbohydrates, but the simple sugars should have very little of them. Okay? Because these are the guys that'll get into your bloodstream, they spike your blood sugar, that makes your body produce something called insulin. It's really hard on your pancreas. If you don't burn these sugars, they get stored as fat very easily. And these can cause diabetes, they can cause obesity, they can cause all sorts of problems if you have too many of them. Okay? Once in a while, no big deal, but try and limit them in your diet. Now, we're going to be going to the lab on Friday. Okay, and part of the lab we're going to be doing on Friday is identifying macromolecules in samples. Now, we use a special test called Benedict's test in order to determine whether we have simple sugars in a sample or not. Now, do you guys need to know about Benedict's test for your exam next Wednesday? Yes, you do. Do you have to know what a positive test for Benedict's is? Yes, you do. Do you have to know what a negative test is? Yes, you do. Okay, so essentially it's this. Benedict's is normally a nice blue color. Okay, and that has to do with copper ions. So copper ions are floating around in Benedict's solution and it makes it this nice blue color. If there is a simple sugar like glucose or fructose in a sample, the glucose or fructose will reduce those copper ions and they will change color to anywhere from a red to an orange color. All right? So if you put Benedict's into a sample and it stays blue, there's no reducing sugars in there. There's no monosaccharides. If it turns red or orange, then you know you have simple sugars like glucose or fructose in that sample. Okay? And that's Benedict's solution. So again, monosaccharides are sometimes called simple sugars, and they can also be known as reducing sugars because they will turn Benedict's solution from blue to red. So already I've confused some of you, I know. All right? A simple sugar, a monosaccharide, and a reducing sugar, they're all the same thing. So simple sugar, monosaccharide, reducing sugar, all the same thing. How do I know if I have a simple sugar in a sample? So for example, if I were to take a bit of Sprite and put it into a test tube and I dropped in some blue Benedict solution, what color would that Sprite turn? Would turn red, exactly, because there's simple sugars in that Sprite. Okay? Now another type of simple sugar is called a disaccharide. What does the prefix di stand for? Two. So a monosaccharide is a simple sugar that has one sugar unit. A disaccharide is a simple sugar that has two sugar units. You guys have heard of some of these sugars as well, I think. Sucrose. If you're a coffee drinker like I am, maybe you drink tea, okay, you might have some table sugar at home. That's the white granulated sugar. That's sucrose. Okay? Where do I find lactose? Milk, right. This is found in milk. And then maltose, again, you'll find that added to all sorts of foods like, chocolate bars and that sort of thing. So these sugars are all sweet. They all have a very sweet taste. Our bodies love them. In fact, our brains react to sugar like it does to drugs, believe it or not. We have the same euphoria when you eat something really sweet that you would get by taking some cocaine. A lot less, of course, but you can get addicted to sugar. It's been proven. Okay, and you can actually have withdrawal symptoms from sugar because your brain gets joy out of eating sugar. Okay, you actually get a dopamine rush from ingesting sugar. Again, what do you notice about these words? They end in ose. That tells you we're dealing with a sugar. Okay? Now, sucrose, lactose, and maltose are all examples of disaccharides, meaning that what we've done is we've taken two monosaccharides and joined them together. For example, look at sucrose. Sucrose is made of glucose, which is a monosaccharide, and fructose, which is a monosaccharide. So we've joined the two monosaccharides together to get a disaccharide. Now, this is where some chemistry comes in. When we join sugar units together, we're taking two smaller units and joining them together into a larger unit. You guys remember what type of metabolism that was called? So we're not breaking apart things. We're putting small things together into a larger thing. That's called anabolic, right? So when a plant, we don't do this, but when a plant makes a disaccharide, it is doing an anabolic reaction, and it's a specific anabolic reaction called dehydration synthesis. Did anybody take chemistry last quarter? Is anybody taking chemistry this quarter? Okay, that's good. It's a hard class, so I'm glad you're not taking bio and chem together. Eventually, if you are going to take chemistry, your chem teacher is not going to call this dehydration synthesis. They're going to call it a condensation reaction. So just be aware that it's the same thing. In chemistry and biology, we just call them by two different names. What is dehydration synthesis? Well, it's an anabolic reaction. And what happens is we take two sugar units. Okay, so let's say that this right here is a glucose. Okay, and right here is another glucose. Okay, those are monosaccharides. And what I want to do is I want to join them together to make a disaccharide. Okay, so in order to do that, there's a special chemical reaction called dehydration synthesis that occurs. Now, Dehydration. If you're dehydrated, what does that mean? You've lost water. Okay, you're lacking water. You don't have water. And does anyone remember what synthesis means? If I synthesize something, what am I doing? I'm creating something. Okay, so dehydration synthesis means I'm creating something by getting rid of water. So if I take a look at these sugar units, what you'll notice is that if I look at these sugar units, I have these things called hydroxyl groups. And again, when you get to Chem 30, you're going to be doing organic chemistry. You're going to learn all about these groups. Okay, so an OH group is known as a hydroxyl group. And you'll notice that both sugars have hydroxyl groups hanging off of them there. Okay, now in dehydration synthesis, what I do is I get rid of one hydroxyl group, get rid of it completely. Okay, boom, gone. Off the other hydroxyl group, I'm not going to get rid of both the H and the O, I'm just going to get rid of the H. Okay, so now I've removed an OH and I've removed an H. What happens if I put two H's and an O together? What happens if I take two H's and an O and put them together? Have you guys ever seen water written like this before? Yeah, okay. So basically what I've done is I've taken the H off of one sugar, I've taken the OH off of the other sugar, and what I've created is H2O. So I've gotten rid of a water, dehydration. I've taken a water out of there. Now what I have left is I have this oxygen right here left. And again, I don't know if you guys remember from Science 10 chemistry, but oxygen can bond 2 times. So this oxygen is bonded to this carbon right here, and it has a free bond that it can make. So what it does is it bonds to this carbon, and it forms what's known as an oxygen bridge. And it binds the two glucose molecules or whatever, monosaccharide molecules together to form a disaccharide. All right? So that's known as dehydration synthesis. Why dehydration? I pulled the water out of there. Why synthesis? I created a disaccharide out of two monosaccharides. And this is an example of an anabolic reaction. I created a larger molecule from two smaller molecules.
A process of linking monomers, called dehydration synthesis, involves the removal of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom to form water.
Okay, so let's do that again. Watch what happens. These green little bean things, those are my monosaccharides. Okay, and you'll notice that they have a hydroxyl group hanging off of them. Watch what happens when two of the monosaccharides are joined together.
A process of linking.
Okay, notice there's my two sugars. There's my two monosaccharides, the green things. The purple thing, that's called an enzyme. We're going to talk about that later. Okay, but what I want you to concentrate on right now are the two green things. Oh.
A process of linking monomers, called dehydration synthesis, a process of linking monomers, called dehydration synthesis.
Okay, so notice that now we've removed a water from there. Okay, we removed an OH from one of the sugars and an H from the other sugar, and they combine together to make water. What now happens between the two monosaccharides? There's what's called an oxygen bridge there. And they've joined the two monosaccharides into something called a disaccharide. Okay, mono meaning one. We don't have one sugar unit anymore. They've joined together to make a sugar with two sugar units. And they're joined by that bridge. Okay? Now, our bodies don't like disaccharides. If you drank a big glass of milk this morning you have lactose in your small intestines right now. Okay, and you cannot absorb lactose into your bloodstream. Okay, your small intestine doesn't know how to do that. So what you have to do first is you need to break that oxygen bridge, and you need to break it apart so that you now have two monosaccharides, and then your body can absorb it. Okay, so it cannot absorb disaccharides or bigger. It can only absorb monosaccharides. So what's happening right now, if you had milk for breakfast right now, your body's doing this. It's taking that lactose, that disaccharide, and it's breaking it apart. If you had sugar in your double double this morning, okay, you have sucrose in your small intestine, same thing. You can't absorb sucrose. You have to break it apart. So the way we break apart a sugar is we do the opposite of dehydration synthesis. We do what's called hydrolysis. What's the prefix hydro? Water. Okay, and something you probably haven't heard before, lysis means to cut. So hydrolysis means to cut using water. Okay, so here is my disaccharide. If I add water to the disaccharide, what it's going to do is it's going to cut this oxygen bridge, and it's going to reform those two hydroxyl groups, and it breaks apart the disaccharide into two monosaccharides. So what is this? What type of metabolic reaction is this? Catabolic. Good. So hydrolysis is a catabolic reaction. Dehydration synthesis is an anabolic reaction. All right. So that's the kind of stuff you're going to make notes of in your note package. That's not on the screen, right? I didn't put up here that hydrolysis was a catabolic reaction. So that's something you might want to put in brackets, right? That might be important later. I didn't put that dehydration synthesis was an anabolic reaction. That's something you might want to write in the margin. Right? So carbohydrates, as I mentioned, should make up the bulk of your diet, but you should limit your intake of simple carbs. Simple sugars, especially monosaccharides, are easily absorbed into your bloodstream, and if they don't get used up immediately, they get stored as fat. And in order to store these sugars, your body has to produce something known as insulin. That's produced by an organ called your pancreas. And if you have too much sugar in your life, your pancreas eventually gives out. It can't produce enough insulin. As well, the insulin has these receptors on your cells, and those receptors will break down. And you can develop something known as type 2 diabetes. Okay? So, too much simple sugar in your diet can result in obesity and eventually type 2 diabetes. So you have to be careful. Unfortunately, look at the picture that I have there. Those are all simple carbs, but they're all delicious. Donuts and Smarties and Snickers bars and white bread and bagels and pop and Slurpees. I mean, those are all delicious. I love them all, but you can't have them every day, right? Or maybe just a little tiny dessert, or after lunch or dinner, but not 6 donuts every day, not a pop every single day, right? So we just have to limit our intake of these sugars. Complex carbohydrates have more than 2 sugar units. Okay, so complex carbohydrates, if we're talking about simple carbohydrates, it's either a monosaccharide or a disaccharide. So it either has 1 sugar unit or 2 sugar units. As soon as we add more than 2 sugar units, we are now into something called a complex carbohydrate. Okay, no longer a simple carbohydrate. As you can see up on the board there, as I mentioned, we represent individual sugar units using these shapes. So in organic chemistry, rather than draw out all the carbons and all the hydrogens and all the oxygens, we draw shapes instead. Okay, so you can see there that the examples I have up on the board have many more than 2 sugar units combined together. But what do they all have in common with the disaccharides that we talked about earlier? So notice how they're put together. Exactly. So between each sugar unit, you'll notice that there's that oxygen bridge, right? How were those oxygen bridge formed? Dehydration synthesis. So it's exactly the same process, whether you're joining 2 monosaccharides together or 2,000 monosaccharides together, it's the same process, okay? Dehydration synthesis. So the prefix poly means many. Complex carbohydrates are also known as, AKA, also known as polysaccharides. Okay, poly means many. Now, how many is many? Thousands and thousands and thousands usually. Cellulose is a gigantic molecule. It's used by plant cells in order to make cell walls and cell structures. So, that tree outside, that big spruce tree outside my window, that spruce tree is like 95% cellulose. Okay. Cellulose is used by plants for structure, and it's a gigantic molecule. We're talking tens or even hundreds of thousands of glucose molecules jammed together in these big long chains. Okay. Starch is another plant polysaccharide. Where do we find a lot of starch? Which kind of foods would you eat that have starch in them? Anyone know? What are some starchy foods? Potatoes, rice, white bread, right? Lots of starch in there. And again, what do you notice about starch? Well, it's just glucose over and over and over again. Glycogen is an animal carbohydrate, meaning we make it. We don't make starch, we don't make cellulose, but we make glycogen. And it's a storage carbohydrate, and we use it for quick access to energy when we're exercising. Okay? So, starch is a plant polysaccharide. It's composed of between 1,000 and 6,000 glucose molecules. And plants use starch as an energy storage molecule. A lot of people think that a potato is a seed, or like a carrot, it's the root of the potato. It's not. It's actually part of the stem. It's called a tuber. And it actually is a storage molecule for the potato plant. Now, when we eat potatoes, we are able to break that starch molecule down very easily. Okay, very quickly. Same with rice. Rice has a lot of starch in it because the rice that we eat is actually the seed of the rice plant, and there's a little baby rice plant inside that seed, and it needs energy to grow. So seeds tend to have a lot of starch in them. Okay, cellulose makes up the cell walls of plants and some bacteria. It's formed by many thousand. By many thousand, we're talking about tens or hundreds of thousands of glucose molecules combined together in big long chains. Now, humans cannot digest cellulose. We do not have the ability to digest this molecule. Okay, just because of the orientation of the glucose molecules, we don't have the ability to break those glucose molecules down. So we can't use the energy in cellulose. But other organisms can. If you're a deer or a moose or a mouse or a rabbit, you could eat cellulose all day long and you can break those molecules down and you can get energy from it. Okay, we can't. Now, glycogen is the only animal polysaccharide on this list, and we find it in our muscle cells, we find it in our liver cells. And this is when we eat too much sugar, the first thing we do is we store it as glycogen, but we only have so much room for glycogen, and it's not very much room. Once we store our glycogen in our liver and our muscles, and there's no more room for glycogen, then we move to fat storage. Okay? Now, if you were to jump on a treadmill right now, you would burn off the sugar that's floating around in your blood first. Then you would go to your glycogen stores after about 45 seconds of work. You go into glycogen. Glycogen is there for about 3 or 4 minutes of work, and then you get into your fat stores. Okay? So it's kind of a process how our body uses energy. So first it's the blood glucose, then it's your glycogen, then you get into your fat stores. Now I want to go back and just show you kind of the structure of these molecules. Notice that we have this other group up here. And again, you guys don't need to know this. My AP group would have to know this, but you guys don't. These groups up here, the CH2OH, that's called a hydroxyl methyl group. And notice that the hydroxyl methyl groups are all lined up in starch. Okay, they're all on the same side. We are able to break starch molecules down, our body. But notice cellulose. Look at those hydroxyl methyl groups. They're actually, it's twisted. Starch molecule has a twist, or the cellulose molecule has a twist to it. And just by adding that little twist in, our bodies don't recognize it, and we can't break it down. And then finally, glycogen. What I want you to notice about glycogen is it's the only one up here that has branches. That's how you would recognize it on a test. So would I put this on an exam and not label them and ask you what's the, let's say, for example, it's a multiple choice question, and the question was, from the 3 below, can you tell me which one is found in animals? So you would have to know, number 1, that glycogen is an animal polysaccharide, and number 2, you would have to know how to recognize glycogen. How do we recognize glycogen? It's branched. Okay? Starch, nice straight line. Cellulose has a twist to it. So you guys need to know that. Okay? Right? So here's another look. So again, this would be a great item for a test. And what I would do is just give you the chemical structures and not give you the names. And I could ask you all sorts of things. All right? Okay. Now, as I said on Tuesday, carbohydrates get a bad name in society today because of the whole Atkins, South Beach keto thing, right? Keto is the big craze these days. You see keto drinks and you see keto menu items when you go to the restaurant, and keto bars and all this kind of stuff. What is keto? Well, ketosis is a special type of reaction that occurs in your body where basically what your body's doing is it's using fat and protein as an energy source instead of carbohydrates. So the idea is if you don't eat any carbohydrates, your body is going to go to your fat stores and it's going to break those down and use them as energy. And is that true? 100%, absolutely. That people lose a ton of weight on the keto diets. It's not very good for you though. Ketones, which are produced in ketosis, are actually kind of poisonous for you. Okay, our body evolved to use carbohydrates as energy. The thing is we don't want to get to the point where we have to burn our fat in the first place. So we have to make good dietary choices in the first place. So I told you guys that not all carbohydrates are the same, right? There are quote unquote carbs that we should have more often, and there are carbs that we should have less often. Things like starches and simple sugars, we should try and incorporate in our diets less often. Okay, so once in a while, you don't want to have a 2 liter of pop of Coke every single day, right? You don't want to eat a loaf of white bread every day. You don't want white bagels every day, right? French fries. Once in a while, hey, we have to live, right? French fries are delicious. I would never tell you don't ever eat a French fry again. That's awful. But have them every single day? Probably not. So what types of carbohydrates should we be eating? We should be eating complex carbs, but ones that are difficult for our bodies to break down. We've got to make our bodies work a little bit for our energy. Now, we are going to be going to the lab, as I mentioned, either tomorrow or Monday. I'm not 100% sure yet, depending on where we get today. Another test that you guys are going to be asked to do is a test for starches, and it's the iodine test. So iodine is generally kind of a yellowish, clear yellowish fluid. When iodine comes into contact with starch, it turns inky black. Okay, so a negative for starch would be yellow for the iodine test, and a positive for starch would be black in the iodine test. Could you use Benedict's reagent, or sorry, Biuret? No, Benedict's. That's the one we talked. Could you use Benedict's to test for starch? No, Benedict's is used to test for simple sugars, monosaccharides. Okay, so it would not. You'd get a negative for monosaccharides with the Benedict's test. As I mentioned, very few organisms can actually break down cellulose. Cows, it's funny, this slide says, do you know that cows have 4 stomachs? They don't actually have 4 stomachs. They have 1 stomach, but it has 4 compartments to it. Okay, we always learn in elementary school that a cow has 4 stomachs. That's not quite true. They have a compartmentalized stomach. Cellulose is extremely hard to break down. We can't break it down at all. Cows have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that enable them to break cellulose down. And the cellulose that they eat, they're eating grass all day long. That's just pretty much all cellulose, right? You and I couldn't eat grass and live on it. We would starve to death if all we had to eat was grass. Cows, they can break those bonds down. And they can do that because they have bacteria living in those stomachs. And the cellulose spends a lot of time in those stomachs, and it goes from chamber to chamber to chamber to chamber. A lot of times what a cow can do is it can swallow the grass, and then it will regurgitate it. It can actually, they'll kind of throw it up in their mouths, and then they keep chewing it, and then they'll swallow it, and they'll let the bacteria go to town a little bit. Then they regurgitate it and chew it again. So they're always chewing because they're regurgitating what's called cud. It's called cud. Then they swallow it again and regurgitate it, and then eventually it gets to the other chambers where it gets further broken down, and eventually they can get energy from it. Termites are another organism that can eat 2x4s, right? Termites can eat your house. They can eat the walls of your house. How? Could you eat a 2x4 and live? No. You wouldn't get energy from it, right? Not to mention the splinters. So we don't have to go there. But these guys can do that. They can eat the 2x4s in your house because they have bacteria living in their guts that can break the cellulose down. So as for us, is there a purpose for eating cellulose? Okay, you're supposed to be eating fruits and vegetables every single day. But if those fruits and vegetables are mainly cellulose and we can't digest it, is there any purpose to having salad with your dinner tonight? Is there any purpose to eating an apple at lunch today? The answer is yes. Even though we can't digest the cellulose in the salad and in the apple, it works to do a couple of things. Number one, the simple sugars that you're eating along with it, they are absorbed much more slowly and much less insulin has to be released. Okay, so cellulose is a good moderator of blood sugar and insulin levels. Number two, no pun intended, it's actually really good for your digestive system as far as having regular bowel movements. Okay, it's really good for digestive health, and it helps to get rid of toxins, and it helps to make up your feces. Okay, so undigested material helps to sweep out your large intestine and colon, and it's been proven that diets that are rich in fiber, okay, that's what we call cellulose in our diets, is fiber. Diets rich in fiber help to reduce colon cancer. okay? Because it helps to get rid of that junk that sits in your colons, okay? So when I say that carbohydrates should make up 60% of your diet, does that mean that donuts should make up 60% of your diet? No. Okay. Once in a while, absolutely, you should have one. But what is that 60% mostly made up of? Fiber. Okay. Seeds, beans, vegetables, fruit, that sort of thing. All right. It fills you up. Our bodies can't really use it for energy, and it helps to maintain good bowel health. All right. So another name for cellulose is fiber. Now, the Canada Food Guide recommends that we have about 30 grams of simple sugars per day. You guys don't have this. This is just kind of a public health addendum, okay? Because a lot of people don't know this. So Health Canada says that you should have about 30 grams of added sugar. That's sugar that's added to your food. That's not sugar from things like fruits and vegetables. All right, now let's put that in perspective. What does that mean? Most people don't have a clue what that means. So this is a 591 milliliter Coca-Cola. That's a bottle of Coke that you'd buy out of a vending machine. Okay. Now in 250 milliliters, the buggers trick us on our nutritional labels. Okay. They're not telling you what's in that bottle. They're telling you what's in 250 mils. How many of us drink half a bottle and put it away? Not me. I drink the whole thing, right? So in that entire bottle, there are more than 60 milligrams of added sugar. So you might look at that label and go, oh, 30 milligrams or 30 grams of sugar. Great, I'm okay. But remember, that's in 250 mils. So if you drank that whole bottle, you're actually getting 60 grams of added sugar. That's double what Health Canada recommends in one small bottle of Coke. Not to mention, you probably had a chocolate bar with it, right? Because you were probably feeling snacky. You might have had dessert later that day with your dinner. So you might easily get 6, 7, 8 times the recommended sugar without even thinking about it. A chocolate bar and a bottle of Coke, you're already at 3 or 4 times what you should be, right? So it's easy to go over that. Now, some people might say, okay, you know what? I don't drink pop. No way. I know it's unhealthy. I drink juice. Well, let's take a look at the nutritional labels for juice. Okay, so let's say you have apple juice. What do you notice about the nutritional label for apple juice? It's exactly the same as a bottle of Coke. My mother-in-law, guys, you'll learn all about mother-in-laws later on in your life. My mother-in-law and I don't see eye to eye a lot of times, and she used to come in the morning and look after my little kids when my wife and I went to work, and she would feed my little tiny boys, little like 30-pound boys, this giant glass of apple juice in the morning. And one day I told her, I'm like, can you please not do that? Because one of my kids was getting a little chubby, and the pediatrician said, got to ease off on the sugar. So I told her one morning, I'm like, okay, enough with the apple juice. It's pure sugar. Please don't do that anymore. She's like, what are you talking about? Apple juice is healthy. I'm like, you know what? Like, you might as well feed them a glass of Coke every morning. Like, it's the same thing. And she completely disagreed with me. She's like, no, you're out of your mind. Like, okay, I don't only do this for a living. Like, I'm kind of know what I'm doing, but no, I'm an idiot. So I actually had to show her this. And if you take a look, there is very little difference between the nutritional label of the apple juice and the Coke. What's really the only justification for having the apple juice? The vitamin C. But what did I mention about vitamin C on Tuesday? Do you guys remember? If you have over 100% of your vitamin C, what happens to the extra vitamin C? Does anyone know? You urinate it out. It's water soluble. It's gone. It's down the toilet. Okay. And you can get all your daily intake of vitamin C from 3 strawberries, right? So again, what about orange juice? Any better for you? Anybody want to take a guess? Same thing, 28 grams of sugar, right? So I thought fruit was supposed to be healthy. Didn't I not just say 2 minutes ago that you're supposed to have fruit? Yeah, you're supposed to have fruit, not fruit juice. Instead of drinking a giant glass of apple juice, what should you have instead? An apple. Okay. So here's an apple compared to an apple juice. Look at the daily fiber in an apple. Look at the daily fiber in apple juice, right? So what we want is, yeah, we're getting sugar in our apple. Take a look at the sugar. Where's the sugar? 19 grams of sugar. That's a lot of sugar, but we're also getting 4 grams of fiber. And what that fiber is going to do is it's going to slow the absorption of that sugar. It's going to make you feel full. Does anybody feel full after a giant glass of apple juice? No. But if you ate a big apple, it's going to take space up in your belly. It's going to make you feel full, right? And it's going to slow the absorption of that sugar. So instead of having apple juice, have an apple. Instead of having orange juice, have an orange, right? I have quite a bit of homework today. I want you to work on page 6 of your note package at some point today.